So, if you've been staying up to date on fecal egg counts and dewormer efficacy, you might know that we used to deworm blindly every 2 to 3 months. And now the current recommendations are to perform a fecal egg count to determine what parasites your horse has and how many eggs are they shedding. And so with those fecal egg counts, we ultimately divide our horses into one of three categories: a low, moderate, or high shedder. With that said, I think this chart is very useful because it tells us how much of the horse population falls into each category. And so ultimately, our low shedders are going to make up the majority of the population. In comparison, our moderate shedders and our high shedders are making up a much smaller part of the population. What I found interesting with this is the current thought is that their shedding level is actually not related to their parasite burden at this time. Low shedders can actually have a high parasite burden. They're just not at the reproductive point of shedding those eggs, or their immune system can just impact how many eggs are actually shed. And so what I want you to think about here is just because your horse is a low shedder does not mean they don't have parasites and they don't need to be dewormed at all. Also because we're only going to be able to identify a few different parasites from our fecal egg count. So not every single parasite is going to be evident on a fecal egg count, but again, the shedding level is not necessarily representative of the parasites inside of them. It's just telling us how many parasites they're depositing into the environment. And if we think back to the goals of deworming, one of the main goals is to reduce the amount of parasites shed or, deposited into the environment. And so that is why we want to know shedding level, is because I want to target my moderate and high shedders more to reduce that shedding into the environment, and knowing that it's just a small part of the population that fall under these categories. And so performing these fecal egg counts, identifying my moderate and high shedders and deworming them more frequently is going to be really effective in helping reduce the development of resistance to these parasites. And so, one, it'll determine which class of dewormer we use, and two, how frequently we're deworming our horses. And so here's an example of a setup I've used to determine our the amount of parasites in feces. So we have this fecal solution, a graduated cylinder to measure. We have to get, you get 4 grams of poop, 26 mils of this flotation solution. You mix them all together, you strain it, and then you put it under a microscope in a slide. And so if you see these little oval things right here, those are strongyle eggs, okay? And then we count those, and you count them, you multiply them, and you get how many eggs are present per gram, okay? So while determining the eggs that are present, so the parasite eggs present, and the shedding level is important, the real recommendation for our fecal egg counts is to perform a fecal egg count reduction test. What this is you take a fecal egg count, find your moderate and high shedders, deworm them, and then 2 weeks later, you do another fecal egg count. By doing this, you can say, hey, this horse had 500 eggs per gram before I dewormed, and they have 400 eggs per gram after I dewormed. That is only a 20% reduction. This is not an effective dewormer for this horse. Or maybe they get down to 0. That would be the goal, right? And then you're like, wow, this dewormer is effective. With that said, you need to be doing this for horses who have, a decent number of eggs in their manure. And you also need to do it for a good percent of your population. So you can't just do it for one horse to determine efficacy. You should be doing at least 5, but I think the recommendation is closer to, 20% of your horses or whoever is a high shedder in that herd. And so technically, our dewormers should be above, 90% effective. And if they're not, if we're seeing this lower percent reduction, now we're saying, hey, these parasites are resistant to this dewormer. This is not a dewormer I want to choose to use. And so that is something that's important to know is I'll provide some deworming recommendations, but there's going to be a disclaimer below of do not use a dewormer that is not effective for your herd. And you won't know that unless you do a fecal egg count reduction test. One other thing you can do to determine how effective your dewormers are is an egg reappearance period. I would say you guys probably wouldn't be really focusing on these. I've done them for research, but you basically just take a fecal egg count every week to determine when those eggs come back. And this is only useful if the dewormer is effective in the first place. So we've only been able to do them for ivermectin and moxidectin because everything else wasn't effective for our herd. But what we basically, the big takeaway is when these anthelmintics were introduced, sometimes it would be up to 22 weeks before eggs would come back. Now we're down to 4 to 5 or up to 12 weeks. And I can say we did a study on ivermectin and we were seeing an even lower egg reappearance period of 4 to 5 weeks for a lot of our horses. So that's another change we've been seeing and something you can evaluate with fecal egg counts to determine that dewormer efficacy.